So welcome everyone. On behalf of the Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of London and the Baha'i community of London, we have the honor and pleasure of a presentation tonight about Abdu'l-Baha from Huda Etumat. And before she begins, I'm going to just say a few words of introduction. Growing up in a Baha'i family, Huda's passion for serving the Baha'i faith has taken her to Israel and Macau, China, where she lived and worked for 7 and 8 years respectively. She works in the field of education and has received her Doctor of Education from the University of Western Ontario. In this presentation, she will be exploring the personage and significance of Abdu'l-Baha. And just keep in mind that after the presentation is finished, there will be room for discussion and reflections and questions. And we encourage and welcome you to stay with us for that time if you choose.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And good evening, everybody. First, I would like to thank you for joining us this evening. I know it's a beautiful summer evening and it's wonderful to be out, but I appreciate you joining this gathering as we take some time to explore the life of Abdu'l-Baha together. So I'm by no means an expert or a scholar of the Baha'i faith, and this presentation is really born out of a place of love. Having been raised in a Baha'i family, I was introduced to the stories of Abdu'l-Baha from a very young age. And I remember vividly these stories that demonstrated his kindness, love for humanity, selfless service, and generosity of spirit, his wonderful sense of humor and strong advocacy for justice. There is no way that in the time allotted we can delve deeply into his personage or significance, so please accept this presentation as just a brief overview into the life and significance of a man who was the embodiment of every Baha'i ideal. Howard Colby Ives, a minister living in the United States, described having met Abdu'l-Baha in these terms: "To estimate, even to imagine the possibilities of the human soul is beyond man's thinking. I am man's mystery, and he is my mystery." Abdu'l-Baha says that no man can know himself, since it is impossible to look at oneself from without. Because of this, and because men commonly tend to accept a lower estimate of their own capacities rather than a higher, a certain heroism is essential to high attainment. This is true, of course, when the goal is a material one. It is not generally realized that it is much more true when the plane of seeking is spiritual. To accept the dictum that nothing is too good to be true and nothing is too high to be attained requires a willingness to run counter to the accepted standards of men, who, as a rule, measure their ambitions by a quite different standard. After meeting Abdu'l-Baha, life, as I had intimated, assumed a very different aspect. But in what that difference consisted, I could not then determine. And after these 25 years, I cannot now fully determine, except that a goal had emerged from the mist surrounding worthy of supreme struggle and sacrifice. I began to see, dimly indeed, but clearly enough to give me hope, that even if I could not know myself, I knew with certainty that heights far beyond ever before dreamed attainable lay before me and could be reached. This was all I knew, but it was much. I remember saying to myself over and over, "At last the desire of my soul is in sight." I gazed at Abdu'l-Baha with a mixture of hope and despair. The world and I in turmoil, and here was peace. He sat or stood, walked or talked in a world of his own. Yet with beckoning hands to all who yearned and strove, it seemed to me that he stood at the heart of a whirlwind in a place of supreme quiet, or at the hypothetical, perfectly still center of a rapidly revolving flywheel. I looked at this stillness, this quietude, this immeasurable calm in Abdu'l-Baha, and it filled me with a restless longing akin to despair. Is there any wonder I was unhappy? For I was desperately unhappy. Was I not in the outer circle of that raging tornado? And to attain that center of stillness meant the traversing of the storm. But to know there was a center, nay, to see one sitting calmly there, was a knowledge, a glimpse never before attained. And so, another divine paradox. In my misery of doubting, hope lay in the first hint of divine assurance. In the divine assurance I had ever known. I remembered another arresting phrase in the 7 valleys and said to myself, though I search for 100,000 years for the beauty of the friend, I shall never despair, for he will assuredly direct me into his way. For those who met Abdu'l-Baha in their lifetime, they often said they could see their life in 2 distinct parts. The first prior to their meeting him, and the second after, which to them seemed full of spiritual insight. Tonight, I would like to take a journey with you through the life of a unique individual who has been described as a man of great spiritual stature and prophetic vision. He has been further described by Ethel Stefana Stevens as someone who had the highest degree of that great gift which we call personality. His readily given sympathy, his understanding of human nature, his power of interesting himself in every human soul, which asked his advice or help. That subtler quality of spirituality which was felt rather than understood by those with whom he came into contact. However magnetic Abdu'l-Baha's personality and however sharp his insights, such tributes cannot adequately capture his uniqueness in religious history. The Baha'i writings affirm that in the person of Abdu'l-Baha, the incompatible characteristics of a human nature and superhuman knowledge and perfection have been blended and are completely harmonized. We know that we are currently too close to his ministry to fully understand the impact of Abdu'l-Baha. But as time passes, this will become more to light. We can view the life of Abdu'l-Baha in 2 distinct periods. The first being from 1844, which was the year of his birth, to the passing of his father in 1892. During this period of his childhood, youth, and adulthood, he was under the direction and supervision of his father, Baha'u'llah, who was the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith. From the year of 1863, which was the year that Baha'u'llah declared himself as a prophet of God, to 1892, Baha'u'llah's passing, Abdu'l-Baha served his father as the chief officer of foreign affairs for the household. He dealt with various mayors and dignitaries, the army, the everyday needs of their moves, of accommodations, and arranging for the pilgrims, their meetings with Baha'u'llah, and their needs. He helped Baha'u'llah as his primary secretary, and today we have the most holy book, the Kitab al-Aqdas, and the Book of Certitude, the Kitab al-Iran, in the handwriting of Abdu'l-Baha. The second period was from 1892, the passing of his father, to his own passing in 1921. His father, Baha'u'llah, appointed all to turn to his eldest son, Abdu'l-Baha, following his passing. Through this appointment, a covenant was formalized to ensure unity of the Baha'i community and the preservation of the integrity of Baha'u'llah's teachings. As the center of the covenant, Abdu'l-Baha interpreted the teachings of his father's faith, amplified its doctrines, and outlined the central features of its administrative institutions. Abdu'l-Baha devoted his life to furthering his father's faith. He served as an unerring guide and architect of a rapidly expanding Baha'i community. He promoted the ideals of peace and unity and became recognized worldwide as a champion of social justice and an ambassador of international peace. Let's go back to the beginning. This story starts in the country we know today as Iran. Abdu'l-Baha was born at midnight on the 23rd of May, 1844, in the city of Tehran. At that time, it was known as Persia, and as you can see on the map, it consisted of a larger space that today we know as Iran and Afghanistan. His birth brought great happiness to his parents, Baha'u'llah and Asiya Khanum, for two children born to them earlier had died in early infancy. He was named Abbas after his paternal grandfather, who was a distinguished vizier or minister in the province of Nur, and who had passed away just 5 years earlier. At the time of his birth, his parents were living in a rented house near Shemran Gate, not far from the home of his grandfather. Abbas, who we know today as Abdu'l-Baha, was just 3 months old when Baha'u'llah received a scroll of the Bab's writings. Upon receiving it and reviewing its contents, Baha'u'llah immediately and unconditionally accepted the message of the Bab. The Bab, known as the herald of the Bahá'í faith, announced that he was the bearer of a message destined to transform the life of humanity. He called for spiritual and moral reformation, drawing attention to improving the station of women and assisting the poor, calling for a spiritual renewal. Baha'u'llah and his family accepted the message of the Bab, devoted their time to serving those around them. Baha'u'llah and Asiya Khanum spent their time and wealth on feeding the hungry, helping the oppressed and downtrodden. They became the father of the poor and the mother of consolation. This stood in contrast to the pattern of life of noble contemporaries at that time. Abdu'l-Baha enjoyed a privileged and happy childhood. In 1847, a sister was born to him, whom his parents named Bahi'í, and in 1949, another son was born, whom his parents named Mehdi, in honor of Baha'u'llah's brother who had died a year earlier. One account of his childhood that we have is from Nabil, a chronicler. He writes about a visit to Baha'u'llah's house when he was asked to accompany Abdu'l-Baha to school. He writes,
I gladly consented. I saw a child of exquisite beauty emerge from the room and descend the steps leading to the gate of the house. I advanced and stretched forth my arms to carry him. We shall walk together, he said, and he took hold of my hand and led me out of the house. We chatted together as we walked hand in hand in the direction of the school. As we reached his classroom, he turned to me and said, "Come again this afternoon and take me back to my home." I returned that afternoon to conduct him to his home.
As the Bab's teachings and message spread throughout Iran, arousing hope and excitement among people from all walks of life, the Muslim clerics grew threatened by his growing influence. They denounced the Bab's teachings as heretical and set out to destroy him and his followers. The Bab was imprisoned and banished from city after city, and his followers were cast into prisons, persecuted and martyred. Their homes were pillaged and destroyed, their possessions confiscated. Ultimately, in July 1850, the Bab was executed. As a follower of the Bab, the authorities sought to find evidence linking Baha'u'llah with the Babi movement. And in 1852, after a misguided act of some Babi followers, acting from a place of despair and grief, the authorities found the excuse they needed to launch a pogrom against the Babis. Fierce persecutions broke out against the Bab's followers, of whom Baha'u'llah was the most prominent. So when Abdu'l-Baha was just 8 years old, his father, a follower of the Bab, was arrested and sent to prison. As a mob made their way to their home, Asiya Khanum had just enough time to gather a few possessions together, pick up Mirza Mehdi, who was just 3 years old, into her arms, and with Abdu'l-Baha and Bahi'í Khanum following close behind their mother, escape into the night. This was a turning point for this family. Through the help of a relative, Asiya Khanum was able to secure a room close to the prison, where her husband was being held. Not knowing what was to become of her husband, and with very little money and food, the family struggled to survive. Abdu'l-Baha recounted that one day his mother poured some flour into his little hands and asked him to eat it because they couldn't afford or have the facilities to make it into bread. The prison where Baha'u'llah was kept was known as the Black Pit, or Siyah in Farsi. He was in the prison for 4 months. Abdu'l-Baha, missing his father and grieving over the trials that had befallen his family, asked to be taken to see him. He recounts,
They sent me to his blessed presence in the prison. The wardens indicated the cell. I saw a dark, steep place. We entered a small, narrow doorway and went down 2 steps, but beyond those one could see nothing. In the middle of the stairway, all of a sudden, we heard his voice, "Do not bring him in here." So they took me back. We sat outside, waiting for the prisoners to be led out. Suddenly they brought the blessed perfection, Baha'u'llah, out of the prison. He was chained with several others. What a chain! It was very heavy. The prisoners could only move it along with great difficulty. It was sad and heart-rending.
the sight of his father, haggard, disheveled, freighted with chains, hurt Abdu'l-Baha so much that overcome by shock and grief, he fainted and had to be carried away unconscious. Following his release from prison, Baha'u'llah and his family were banished from Iran. This was Abdu'l-Baha's departure from his homeland at only 9 years old. He was never to return to the land of his birth. The family left Iran in the winter of 1853, and the journey from Tehran to Baghdad, Iraq, would take 3 months through a mountain range, which were so cold that Baha'u'llah has described it in these words: "One cannot even speak, the ice and snow so abundant that it was impossible to move." Further, Bahiyah Khanum recounts, "My father was very ill. The chains had left his neck galled, raw, and much swollen. My mother was pregnant. We were all insufficiently clothed and suffering keenly from exposure. My brother," referring to Abdu'l-Baha, "was in particular thinly clad. His feet, ankles, hands, and wrists were exposed to the cold, which was so severe that they became frostbitten and swollen, causing him great pain." We know that the effects of this experience that Abdu'l-Baha suffered lasted throughout his life. Although Abdu'l-Baha's formal education had ended with the arrest of his father and banishment from Iran, in Baghdad he received some lessons from his mother, his uncle, and occasionally his father. Baha'u'llah had also arranged for an imam to discuss academic questions with Abdu'l-Baha. Abdu'l-Baha also learned Arabic during this time. It was during their stay in Baghdad that Baha'u'llah proclaimed himself as a prophet of God. He was the one to be made manifest by God, promised by the Bab. Abdu'l-Baha recognized and accepted his father's faith, and with increased joy and devotion took possession of him, and he consecrated his whole self, body, soul, and spirit to the sacred work of this faith. Abdu'l-Baha's relationship with his father was not merely that of a son who deeply loved his human father, but he recognized Baha'u'llah as his Lord, the one who the Bab had given up his life for. Abdu'l-Baha grew into manhood in Baghdad as he began to take on the tasks of supervising the routine daily activities of their household, ensuring that provisions were adequate and the affairs of the household were dealt with. After 10 years in Baghdad, as a result of pressure exerted by those who were opposed to the new faith, the Shah's government persuaded the Ottoman government to invite Baha'u'llah and his family to move to Constantinople. Today, we know this as Istanbul, Turkey. Abdu'l-Baha made all of the preparations for this journey, which included not only their immediate family and extended family members who had joined them in Baghdad and other believers. When the family left Baghdad, Abdu'l-Baha was 19 years old. The journey took them 3 months. During the journey, Bahiya Khanum describes Abdu'l-Baha's role as special attendant, servant, and bodyguard. She states, "He guarded Baha'u'llah day and night, riding by his wagon and watching near his tent. He thus had little sleep and being young, became extremely weary." Abdu'l-Baha captures the hardship and stress of the journey in these words.
Often by day and by night, we covered a distance of 25 to 30 miles. No sooner would we reach a caravanserai than from sheer fatigue, everyone would lie down and go to sleep. Utter exhaustion having overtaken everybody, they would be unable even to move.
In Constantinople as prisoners, the family were given a very small accommodation. Bahiya Khanum has described the atmosphere as foul and overcrowded. The weather was very cold and damp, and they did not have the proper clothing. Within the same year, they were further banished to Adrianople, which today we know as Edirne, also in Turkey. Although this journey lasted but a few days, it was the most terrible journey they had yet undertaken. It was in the middle of winter and snow fell heavily most of the time. Without proper clothing or food, they suffered greatly. Having reached Adrianople, their accommodation consisted of a small house of 3 rooms, comfortless and vermin infested. The family remained in Adrianople for 4.5 years. Here, Abdu'l-Baha picked up Turkish, and Baha'u'llah resumed teaching his new faith. In early 1868, as Baha'u'llah's opponents became alarmed by the rising prestige of the exiles among the people of Adrianople, and Abdu'l-Baha, now a revered and highly respected figure in Adrianople, they redoubled their efforts to have Baha'u'llah further removed. At that time, Akka, in Palestine and what we know today as Israel, was a prison city. It was where the worst criminals, the most notorious murderers, highway robbers, and political and religious enemies of the Ottoman Empire were sent. It has been described as a walled city of filthy streets and damp, desolate houses, with the air so foul that birds flying overhead would fall dead out of the sky. It was hoped that by exiling the family further to Akka would cause Baha'u'llah, his family, and companions to perish quickly. On arriving there, after a miserable sea journey, Baha'u'llah and his family were imprisoned in the army barracks. The place was dirty to the extreme. There was no beds or comfort of any sort. The food supplied was inadequate, and soon Baha'u'llah and his followers, totaling about 80 men, women, and children, were overcome by malaria, dysentery, and other diseases. There was no source of clean water in the city walls. Sanitary facilities were non-existent, and disease was rampant. 3 people succumbed to their illnesses. This rigorous imprisonment lasted for 2 years. Towards the end of their stay at the army barracks, tragedy struck. Mirza Mehdi, Abdu'l-Baha's younger brother, fell through a skylight while walking and praying on the roof of the barracks. He was fatally injured. Abdu'l-Baha suffered deep sorrow as a result of the passing of his younger brother. In 1870, the barracks were needed for the troops, and the exiles were transferred to a small house within the city. The house was damp, filthy, and vermin-ridden. The room in which Abdu'l-Baha stayed in dripped with a steady leak whenever it rained. Its walls ran with damp, and the floor was thick with dust. Abdu'l-Baha sat and slept on a mat in this room. His bed cover was a sheepskin. Adib Taherzadeh relates the following.
When he slept under the sheepskin, fleas gathered and began biting. Abdu'l-Baha worked out a tactic of defeating the fleas by turning over his sheepskin at intervals. He would sleep for a while before the fleas found their way again to the inner side. He would then turn the sheepskin over again. He would do this several times throughout the night.
In 1876, Sultan Abdulaziz, the Ottoman ruler who had banished the Baha'is to perpetual imprisonment in Akka, was deposed of power. The governorship in Akka also changed many times, and succeeding governors, understanding that these prisoners had not committed any offenses, showed respect towards Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha, even going so far as allowing them to leave the prison city to establish their residence on the outskirts. For the next 15 years, Abdu'l-Baha continued to live in Akka while he moved Baha'u'llah and his family to Mazra'e, a beautiful property outside the city of Akka, and then to Bahji. Staying in Akka afforded Abdu'l-Baha the opportunity to serve as a shield to his father, bearing the burden of meeting with government officials and others, thus assuring Baha'u'llah the time and space needed to reveal his writings and meet with the pilgrims. The burden of all the administrative and daily affairs fell on the shoulders of Abdu'l-Baha, who at a young age had been given the title, the Servant of the Glory. Baha'u'llah, aware that the end of his earthly existence was fast approaching, revealed the Kitab-e-Ahd, the Book of the Covenant, in which he appointed his successor. He did not share the contents of this book to anyone and kept it with himself until his passing, when it was passed to Abdu'l-Baha in a locked box. Abdu'l-Baha was by his father's bedside during Baha'u'llah's final days. Most of the time, he was in a state of deep sorrow and depression. Not only would he be losing his earthly father, but his spiritual guide and Lord. At dawn on May 29, 1892, Baha'u'llah passed away. It was left to Abdu'l-Baha as the eldest son to arrange everything for the family, the friends, and the new faith. On the 9th day of his passing, after his passing, the seal of the box was broken and Baha'u'llah's book was read in the presence of 9 believers. Although heartbroken and devastated at the loss of his father, Abdu'l-Baha took up the role of the center of the covenant, as the center of the covenant. Haji Mirza Haidar Ali has written the following.
The ministry of Abdu'l-Baha began so vigorously that Bahá'í communities everywhere were overwhelmed. Letters from the master poured into every village, town, and country like the drops of the rains. The friends were cheered and enamored by his life-giving words. Abdu'l-Baha wrote to Baha'is wherever they were, in Persia, Egypt, Iraq, India, and Burma.
Dr. Yunus Afrokhzeh, who served for 9 years in Akka as secretary to Abdu'l-Baha, has left this description of Abdu'l-Baha's typical workday.
From Iran and around the world, scientific questions, spiritual queries, and religious problems poured in, and comprehensive answers were given to each one. Many in his own hand and some dictated. It was Abdu'l-Baha's habit to find relief from one tiring occupation by engaging himself in another. For example, when he grew tired of writing, he would turn to dictation of the tablets. And when he grew weary of this, he would summon the pilgrims and impart to them words of counsel and admonition. Once he felt tired out by writing, dictation, or speaking, He would take long walks in the narrow, winding street of the most great prison. And if in the process he encountered a believer or non believer, friend or foe, he would stop and spend a few minutes talking to him of matters of interest to that person. He would also visit the sick and the poor. The sick received his prayers and blessings, and the needy the contents of his money bag. If there was any daylight left, when he returned home, he would summon his secretary and begin where they had left off. In the evenings, he would visit the pilgrims and residents who had gathered in his reception, awaiting his presence.
In 1908, following the Young Turks Revolution, all political and religious prisoners of the Ottoman Empire, including Abdu'l-Baha and his family, were set free. Having entered the prison city of Akka at the age of 24, Abdu'l-Baha was now free at the age of 64. In 1910, at the age of 66, an exile since childhood, with no formal schooling, a prisoner for 40 years in failing health, and unfamiliar with Western customs and languages, he arose without thought of comfort, undeterred by the risks involved, to travel to the West to present Baha'u'llah's teachings. Robert Stockman describes Abdu'l-Baha's time in North America in these words.
This was not the visit of a 67-year-old foreign tourist bent on seeing new places or a religious teacher hoping to cement his fortune and reputation. Rather, it was the effort of an almost indescribable man whose impact on people was superhuman and who used his newfound freedom from 40 years of imprisonment to share his father's message of the oneness of humanity and the principles of universal peace with as many North Americans as possible.
Abdu'l-Baha first traveled to Egypt, where he stayed for 1 year, and then in August 1911, Abdu'l-Baha set sail for Europe, spending a month in London and 2 months in Paris, France. After returning to Egypt for the winter, he set off again in March 1912 for an 8-month-long visit to North America, followed by second visits to London, Paris, and stops in Austria, Germany, Hungary, and Scotland. At Abdu'l-Baha's first ever public talk given at the City Temple Church in London, England, on 10 September 1911, he told the congregation,
"The gift of God to this enlightened age is the knowledge of the oneness of mankind and of the fundamental oneness of religion." Over and over again, he stressed the need for understanding between people, for bringing religions together, for world peace.
Paris-based writer Jan Jason wrote, he wanted to bring people closer to God and for them to understand the reality of religion. During his travels to the West, Abdu'l-Baha made thousands of appearances and spoke to thousands of people, including clergymen, journalists, academics, diplomats, philosophers, suffragettes, and social reformers. But more importantly for him, he met with and attended the needs of the individuals living in the neighborhoods and communities that were struggling with poverty and injustices. Dr. David Starr Jordan, an American scientist and university administrator, stated Abdu'l-Baha will surely unite the East and the West, for he walks the mystical path with practical feet. And further, Mujan Momen, a historian specializing in Baha'i studies, states,
At the beginning of Abdu'l-Baha's ministry, the Baha'i faith was a fairly obscure religious movement. There was very little accurate information about it anywhere. By the end of his life, not just in Europe and North America, but all over the world, in Asia, the Pacific, Australia, South Africa, South America. Large number of people knew about the faith and had a positive impression of it.
Many articles and commentaries were written during his travels to the West, including in such papers as the New York Times, the San Francisco Examiner, the Montreal Daily Star. There are 2 new publications entitled Apostle of Peace, where you can find just a few hundred of the over 2,000 press articles written about Abdu'l-Baha during his lifetime. With regards to the station occupied by Abdu'l-Baha and the significance of this position in this holy dispensation, Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, states, "It would be indeed difficult for us to stand so close to such a tremendous figure and be drawn by the mysterious power of so magnetic a personality to obtain a clear and exact understanding of the role and character of one who not only in the dispensation of Baha'u'llah, but in the entire field of religious history fulfills a unique function." Shoghi Effendi further states that Abdu'l-Baha is and should, for all time, be regarded first and foremost as the center and pivot of Baha'u'llah's peerless and all-enfolding covenant.
His most exalted handiwork,
The stainless mirror of his light,
the perfect exemplar of his teachings,
the unerring interpreter of his word,
the embodiment of every Baha'i ideal,
the incarnation of every Baha'i virtue,
the most mighty branch sprung from the ancient root,
the limb of the law of God,
the being round whom all limbs revolve,
the mainspring of the oneness of humanity,
the ensign of the most great peace,
the moon of the central orb of this most holy dispensation. These styles and titles that are implicit and find their truest, their highest and fairest expression in the magic name Abdu'l-Baha. He is above and beyond these appellations the mystery of God, an expression by which Baha'u'llah himself has chosen to designate him, and which, while it does not by any means justify us to assign to him the station of prophethood, indicates how in the person of Abdu'l-Baha, the incompatible characteristics of human nature and superhuman knowledge and perfection have been blended and are completely harmonized. One of the greatest gifts that Abdu'l-Baha has given us is the example of servitude. Howard Colby Ives explains,
always was his emphasis upon deeds, and deeds of such quality and purity as seemed, to those who listened, unattainable. Nevertheless, there was no lowering of the standard, and he set the example. There was no doubt of that. Like the true leader, he never calls upon his followers to go where he had not blazed the path.
in a talk in 1912, Abdu'l-Baha stated, "I have proclaimed unto you the glad tidings of the kingdom of God and explained the wishes of the blessed perfection. I have set forth that which is conducive to human progress and shown you the humility of servitude." Howard Colby Ives continues, "His spirit of servitude was his distinguishing characteristic. The very title given him by Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha, and by which he wished always to be known and addressed, the servant of glory, was indicative of the essential nature of this quality as it related to the Baha'i teachings. Abdu'l-Baha, being asked to serve as an honorary chairperson, once responded, "I am Abdu'l-Baha and no more. I am not pleased with whosoever praises me by any other title. I am the servant of the Blessed Perfection, and I hope that this servitude of mine will become acceptable. Whosoever mentions any other name save this will not please me at all. Abdu'l-Baha and no more. No person must praise me except by this name. Abdu'l-Baha. Abdu'l-Baha says that the conditions of existence are limited to servitude, prophethood, and deity. That is to say, since manhood is incapable of attainment either to the station of the divine essence or of prophethood, except in unique instances of the anointed ones, the only possible station to which he may aspire is that of servitude. It is important then that this word and its implications be examined. What does Abdu'l-Baha mean by servitude? What possible ground can he have for asserting, as he does by implication, that unless man in this day attains that station, he forfeits the right to be called man at all? When Jesus said, "He that would be the greatest among you, let him be the servant of all. The meek shall inherit the earth." And when he washed his disciples' feet, what did he mean? What was he trying to convey? As though a wide window opened to a breeze from the world of explanation and understanding, Abdu'l-Baha's glorification of the station of certitude becomes clear. For servitude to Abdu'l-Baha is the path, the only possible path to that greatness. And this, I believe, is just the greatness to which Jesus referred, the greatness of true manhood. One of the distinguishing marks of the revelation of Baha'u'llah is his practical explanation of the words of Jesus Christ. Today in our society, we may often receive the opposite message, that the most important thing is taking care of number one, myself. However, Abdu'l-Baha demonstrated to us that our highest station is that of being of service to others. This was his entire life. This story highlights Abdu'l-Baha's sense of generosity.
For Abdu'l-Baha, inexpensive clothes were sufficient. One day he was to entertain the governor of Akka. His wife felt that his coat was hardly worthy of the occasion. Well ahead of time, she went to the tailor, where she ordered a fine coat, thinking that, with his lack of self-consciousness, he would surely not notice that his old coat was missing. He desired, after all, only to be very clean. The new garment was laid out at the proper time, but the master went searching for his own coat. He asked for it, insisting that the one laid out was not his. His wife attempted to explain the new coat, but he would have none of it, and he told her why. But think of this. For the price of this coat, you can buy 5 such as I ordinarily use. And do you think I would spend so much money upon a coat, which only I shall wear? If you think I need a new one, very well. But send this back and have the tailor make me, for this price, 5 such as I usually have. Then you see, I shall not only have a new one, but I shall have 4 to give to the others.
More than the charitable acts that he carried out, was the methods he used to help others understand the fundamental of the oneness of the human race. We must lay aside all prejudice, whether it be religious, racial, political, or patriotic. We must become the cause of the unification of the human race. When Abdu'l-Baha spoke these words in New Jersey in 1912, the concept of unity among all the races was new. Racial segregation was common. In the South, it was legal to separate schools, buses, parks, and other facilities based on race. During his visit to the US and Canada, Abdu'l-Baha gave public talks to thousands of people. He shared Baha'u'llah's teachings about the oneness of humanity and urged his audiences to establish true unity. At his talk to over 1,000 people at Howard University in Washington, D.C., Abdu'l-Baha said,
I am very happy that white and black have gathered together in this meeting. I hope this coming together and harmony reaches such a degree that no distinctions shall remain between them, and they shall be together in the utmost harmony and love.
Following the talk, Abdu'l-Baha had a chance to put his words into practice. He invited Louis Gregory to meet him at the home of a Baha'i named Ali Quli Khan and his family. Khan, as he was known, was a diplomat representing Persia, now Iran, and had planned a special luncheon in Abdu'l-Baha's honor. About 19 guests were invited, some leaders of society and politics in Washington, D.C. Louis Gregory had not been invited to the luncheon, and as such, was waiting for a chance to slip out quietly without disturbing anyone. In arriving at the home, Abdu'l-Baha led the way to the dining room. According to tradition, the seats at the table were carefully arranged, each based on each person's position in society. But when everyone was seated, Abdu'l-Baha suddenly stood up and looked around. He said to Khan, "Where is Mr. Gregory? Bring Mr. Gregory." Khan immediately went to find Louis Gregory and brought him in. Meanwhile, Abdu'l-Baha rearranged the place settings that had been formally laid out. He put Louis Gregory in the place of honor to his right. Louis was the only African American person there. By welcoming him warmly and giving him a prominent seat, Abdu'l-Baha demonstrated that people of all races should be treated equally. He said he was happy to have Louis Gregory there, and during lunch he spoke about the oneness of humanity. Louis Gregory later wrote that Abdu'l-Baha made everyone feel perfectly at ease by his humor, wisdom, and outpouring of love. He also said that Abdu'l-Baha's heart seemed to be a mysterious and boundless treasury of love. I cannot stress the importance of this one event, which occurred in an environment that I don't believe we can adequately fathom. Today we see racism, but perhaps not to the extent that it was openly apparent at that time. Yet Abdu'l-Baha navigated that space with ease. In 1921, Abdu'l-Baha's health started to decline. Although he continued to labor tirelessly, aiding the poor and assisting those in need, keeping up with his correspondence with the believers all over the world, he was suffering. On May 28, 1921, Abdu'l-Baha passed away. The news of his passing inspired an unprecedented event of unity among the Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and Druze communities in Israel. The funeral of Abdu'l-Baha was a funeral the like of which Palestine had never seen. It drew no less than 10,000 people, representing every class, religion, and race in that country. Among the many speakers from all religious backgrounds was Solomon Buzalgo, one of the leading figures of the Jewish population in Haifa, who spoke in French. The following is a translated excerpt of his speech.
It is indeed strange that in an age of gross materialism and lack of faith, a great philosopher such as he, whom we mourn, Abdu'l-Baha, Abbas, should appear. He speaks to our hearts, our conscience. He satisfied our thirsty souls with teachings and principles that are the basis of all religion and morality. In his writings and public talks, and in his intimate conversations, he could always convince the most learned and the most orthodox. His life was the living example of self-sacrifice, of preferring the good of others to one's own. The philosophy of Abdu'l-Baha is simple and plain, yet sublime. It accords with human character. Its virtues overcome prejudice and superstitions. Abbas has passed away in Haifa, in Palestine, in the Holy Land wherein prophets have always appeared. The ancient glory of this land is restored. We are not the only ones who weep for him, in whom we take pride. In Europe, in America, in every country, people athirst for social justice and brotherhood also weep for him. He suffered from despotism, fanatism, and intolerance. For decades, Akka held him as a prisoner. Baghdad also served as a prison for him and for his father. Persia, the ancient cradle of divine philosophy, threw out her children whose ideas were conceived in her land. Cannot we witness the manifestation of divine will to exalt the holy land that it become once again the cradle of noble and generous ideals? He who has left such a glorious heritage is not dead. He who has promulgated such principles is immortal in the memory of posterity.
Following his passing, Abdu'l-Baha's body was interred into one of the rooms of the Shrine of the Bab, which he helped to build on the slopes of Mount Carmel in Haifa. On April 20th, 2019, the Universal House of Justice announced that the time for the construction of a permanent shrine of Abdu'l-Baha had come, which is currently being constructed halfway between Haifa and Akka in Israel. During his lifetime, Abdu'l-Baha wrote over 28,000 books, tablets, and letters. He has written and spoken about the central tenets of the Baha'i faith, such as the independent search after truth, the oneness of the entire human race, the pivotal principle and fundamental doctrine of the Baha'i faith, the basic unity of all religions, the condemnation of all forms of prejudice, the harmony which must exist between religion and science, the equality of rights between men and women, the introduction of compulsory education, and the glorification of justice as the ruling principle in human society. This brief glimpse into the life of such a figure does not do it justice, nor can we fully comprehend his significance at this stage in history. However, I hope that this presentation has inspired you to take some time to add to your summer reading list by considering perusing some of the books we have that have been written by Abdu'l-Baha, some of his talks, vignettes from his life, or stories from those who were very close to him. I wanted to thank Rajdeep for assisting with reading portions of the presentation tonight. Thank you, Daniel, for emceeing, and thank you, everybody, for attending.
Yes, thank